Scott Odell is best known for his most famous book, Island of the Blue Dolphins. And if you've read it, you can probably tell that he knew a lot about plants, animals, history, and human nature. But of course, he didn't start out with all that knowledge. Just like with all of us, as he lived, he learned and grew, and his experiences added to the legacy of work he left for the world. He was born Odell Gabriel Scott on May 23, 1898, in Los Angeles, California. His name was later miswritten as Scott Odell by a typesetter, and he decided that he liked it, so he kept it. But originally, his name was Odell Scott. Now, 1898, this was a time when there were more horses than cars in LA, more jackrabbits than people. Scott remembers going to town in a rubber-tired buggy with a red fringe on top, and the first sound he remembers is that of a wildcat on the roof. His father was in the railroad business, and the Scotts moved around a few times while he was growing up, but they always lived close to the ocean. And young Odell spent precious childhood summers exploring the coastline with friends, taking sea voyages on logs they imagined to be dugout canoes, and searching for devilfish in the rocks. This is one of the places they lived. It's called Terminal Island now. And today it's home to canneries, shipyards, industrial and power plants, even a couple prisons. But when Odell was a boy, it looks like this. It was called Rattlesnake Island then, a place of mudflats and fishermen, and a great place for a curious ocean-loving boy to grow up. The Odells lived in a house on stilts, with the sound of the tide rushing in beneath them as they slept. Odell began writing early when his mom told him that he was related to the famed author Sir Walter Scott. But for the most part, he was a normal kid. He ran track in high school, sort of a star athlete, really, and he was a stellar student. But college, he found, was much harder. And he moved from school to school, taking electives in things that interested him, like history, psychology, and literature, but never actually graduating. Eventually, Odell began looking for work in Hollywood. His first job was to read and critique movie scripts written by amateurs. Now, this was in the very early days of silent films, when movies were called photoplays. And Odell took the things he was learning and wrote his first book, a sort of how-to for novice manuscript writers. He went on to work for the film industry as a set dresser where, fun fact, his slender hands were used in close-up scenes to stand in for Rudolph Valentino's stubby fingers in this film. He later worked for MGM as a technical director and a cameraman. In fact, he traveled to Italy to help film Ben-Hur, the most expensive silent film ever made. After the production was finished, Scott Odell decided to stay in Italy and really focus on becoming a writer. He lived in Florence for a year and came up with his first novel called Pin Feathers. But this book was never published, and none of us will ever read it because Odell, apparently unhappy with how it all turned out, burned it. Well, eventually, of course, he did come home to California and found work at LA newspapers writing book reviews. He wrote another first novel, which he decided not to burn, and also had a brief stint in the Army Air Force during World War II. He finished the war doing night patrol duty off the Southern California coast, sometimes alongside the actor Humphrey Bogart, another volunteer. Can you just imagine their conversations? Over the next 26 years, Odell continued to work as an editor and writer for adults. But he struggled big time with writer's block. He wrote at a speed of about 10 years per novel. He and his wife had a busy social life, attending fancy parties where people discussed things like books and politics, and Odell found it difficult to concentrate with all this distraction swirling around him. So he and his wife moved to the little Southern California gold rush town of Julian, to this house called Stone Apple Farm. And here, while researching another book, he came upon the story of a girl who had lived alone for 18 years on San Nicolas Island just off the California coast. And in writing her story, he found a way to talk about an issue that had become very important to him. Island of the Blue Dolphins began in anger, he said. Anger at the hunters who invade the mountains where I live, and who slaughter everything that creeps or walks or flies. He'd considered writing a letter to the editor, but he figured it would be too easily overlooked or dismissed. So he said, "I wrote Island of the Blue Dolphins about a girl who kills animals and then learns reverence for all life." Armed with his passion and the uniqueness of the story he had discovered, Scott O'Dell was able to write Island of the Blue Dolphins in less than a year. And with its publication and immediate success, winning the Newbery Medal in 1961 and many other awards to follow, he realized he'd found his literary voice, and everything changed. Over the next 29 years, he wrote 25 more children's books, many telling stories of young women overcoming adversity, a rare theme in those days. He also wanted children to love and respect nature, especially since he felt surrounded by those who took harshly from it. In his story of Karana, he shows us not only her dignity, but her respect for the creatures surrounding and sustaining her. When Scott died at age 91, his ashes were scattered over the Pacific Ocean in Southern California. And as the boat turned towards shore, a pod of dolphins appeared, leaping as they led the boat all the way back to San Diego Bay, much like the dolphins who escorted Karana home. Maybe they were saying, as we do now, "Thank you, Scott O'Dell, for persevering, finding your voice, and speaking up for those who cannot speak for themselves."